Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for getting here bright and early. My name is Tyler Mortensen. I'm presenting to you my Masters Thesis Research that was conducted this past spring and winter on the effects of sucrose versus non-nutritive sweeteners on blood glucose levels during exercise. This research was conducted with the assistance of Dr. Racine Emmons, Dr. Michael Figueroa, and Christopher Sue. So what did we know before conducting our research? Sucrose has a high calorie content of about 4 calories per gram, and when consumed, it spikes blood sugar levels. High sugar diets are precursors to adverse health effects like diabetes, and non-nutritive sweeteners are common replacements for sugar in the American diet. These are low to 0 calories and can be found as artificial or natural products. Now, how do these substances affect blood glucose levels? Well, this was really the question at hand during our investigation. And based on past research, we know that the consumption of sucrose or sugar automatically spikes blood sugar levels in the blood and is triggered by receptors in the mouth. These sugar levels can stay elevated for hours after consumption, which is why sugar replacements have come into play. Artificial sweeteners signal receptors in the gut and are actually derived directly from sucrose. Now this can leave sucrose traces in the blood, causing glucose response, causing that glucose to rise. Natural sweeteners, on the other hand, have not been shown to trigger any receptors in the body. And stevia, for example, is derived directly from the stevia plant. Now this has not been shown to spike glucose levels, and has actually chronically been shown to benefit insulin actions over time. So the purpose of our study was to examine the differences between sucrose, sugar, and non-nutritive sweeteners, in our case sucralose and stevia, and their impact on blood glucose during exercise. So the research that we conducted, our participants, they consisted of 20 total, 14 males, 6 females with an age range of 19 to 38 years old. They were all non-athletes but did report exercising at least 3 days a week, and all subjects were excluded from our study if they fit any of the following health criteria, or if they had an allergy or dislike to any of the sweeteners that we used. For our experiment, it was consisted of 4 sessions. All participants arrived on 4 occasions of at least 4 days apart, and they had to arrive in a fasted state of at least 8 hours. They exercised on a monarch bike following the YMCA protocol. I'll show this protocol later if you're unfamiliar with this. And what we measured were heart rate using a polar heart rate monitor around the chest, respiratory exchange ratio using metabolic cart, blood glucose via the finger prick method, and rate of perceived exertion using the Borg scale, which you can see here, subjective scale rating 6 through 20 during exercise. As for our test, when subjects arrived, we collected a fasting blood glucose sample, and then we single-blindly provided them with 1 of 4 beverages. Now these beverages consisted of 30 grams of sucrose, 30 grams of sucralose, 15 grams of stevia, or no additive at all. The no additive was our control in this case to monitor their exercise and their blood glucose levels on a controlled standpoint. These substances and sweeteners were added to a fruit punch flavored solution, a Kool-Aid powder mix. We used this to mimic that of sports drinks like Gatorade to give it the consistency and the flavor. After complete consumption of the beverage, we collected another blood glucose sample to see the reaction of the blood glucose at that time, and participants were prepared for exercise. They were given the heart rate monitor, the metabolic mask for respiratory exchange ratio, and put on the bike for the YMCA bike protocol. Now the protocol is a 12-minute test of 4 stages. Each stage lasts 3 minutes. At the end of each 3-minute stage, we collected their RPE, their heart rate, and their blood glucose. After the termination of exercise, participants rested for 30 minutes, and we collected blood glucose again at the 15 and 30-minute marks. Here's that YMCA bike protocol that we used. All participants started in stage 1 at the same resistance, and based on their heart rate at the end of that stage, determined the resistance for the remainder of the test. Now it's important to point out that whatever protocol was used during their first session was used consistently on the following 3 sessions. This way, it was a consistent exercise protocol on all occasions when they came in. Here's the data sheet that we use for collection, just to clear things up on what we did. So we collected the fasting blood glucose sample and then provided the beverage. Got another glucose sample and set them up for exercise. At the end of each stage of exercise, we collected their heart rate, their RP, RER, and blood glucose, and then rest for 30 minutes, and once again collected their blood glucose samples at 15 and 30 minutes. The data that we collected, we used SPSS, and one thing we looked at was blood glucose. We looked at the time to glucose peak using a paired sample t-test, and looked at glucose load using area under the curve. We also looked at respiratory exchange ratio using a 4x4 drink by time, repeated measures ANOVA, and looked at the time to peak RER using a paired sample t-test. Now, for the results of what we found, looking at blood glucose first, we found that sucrose had the largest glucose load when consumed, and we also found that sucralose had a significantly different blood glucose load than that of the no additive, which was our control. Sucralose also showed a trending difference between itself and stevia when it comes to glucose load. And sucrose, the sugar, peaked latest during exercise during stage 4. Sucralose peaked during stage 3, so not as late as the sucrose, but later than the control and the stevia. When looking at RER, we looked at it at the time of glucose peak, and what we found was, looking at RER, an RER of above 1 is using carbohydrates for energy, and the below 1 is using fat for energy. So in this case, if you look here, the no additive and the stevia were both below 1 using fat for energy at the time of glucose peak, whereas sucrose and sucralose were using carbohydrates for energy at that time. By the end of exercise, all conditions were using carbohydrates for energy above 1 by the time they reached stage 4 of exercise. So in conclusion, what we found was, looking at blood glucose, sucrose had the largest glucose load, and it also had a greater glucose load. Sucralose had a significantly greater glucose load than that of no additive. So what that tells us is that sucralose does impact blood sugar when consumed. So your stevia would impact your blood sugar when you consume. Your Splenda would impact blood sugar when consumed. There's also a trending difference between sucralose and stevia when consumed, and stevia impacted blood glucose similar to the no additive, to the control, showing us that stevia, when you consume that, it has no impact on blood glucose. So it's the same as if you were consuming nothing at all. Blood glucose peak, we found that sucrose steadily raised over the 12 minutes of exercise, and it also peaked much later than all the other conditions. That has told us that sucrose used carbohydrates for energy for a longer period of time, and the carbohydrate stores in your body were depleted sooner during all other conditions. Looking at RER, stevia had a lower RER at the time of glucose peak, telling us that the body uses fat for energy when consuming stevia for a longer period of time, which can in turn aid in weight loss. So our overall conclusion, the so what from what we've really learned from this, is that stevia may be the better chemical-free natural alternative to weight loss. It does not impact blood sugar levels when consumed. It also forces the body to rely on fat for energy for a longer period of time, which is what we want when we exercise, is to dive into those fat stores. Some limitations that we did come across during our study, all the participants did not have the same fitness level, so it made exercise a little tougher to determine for each individual. And there's also a slight difference noticed in the beverages when consumed. Although individuals were not able to tell us what they were consuming, they would just say this is a little more bitter tasting, this is a little more sweet tasting. They weren't able to tell what the beverage was. The mask from the metabolic cart for collecting RER also caused a little bit of claustrophobia and exercise-induced asthma in some individuals, making it a little tougher to exercise at times. And participants did experience some bruising and pain at the site of the finger prick for a few days, but because we put 4 days between each session, that was relieved and by the time they came back in. And then it also became a little more difficult to collect blood as exercise went on, as blood accumulated to the legs while on the bike, making it a little tougher to grab glucose and blood samples from the fingertips. And And here are just some of the top references used during this research that correlated with our study. And that is all.